So hello everyone, wherever you are in the world. I'm just letting you all know that we are now also live on Facebook as well as on Zoom. So I'd like to just welcome everybody who's here with us in the Zoom application, but also everyone who's just joined us live on Facebook. Welcome to Undistance. This is All Out's online Pride Festival with events taking place across June and July, bringing Pride, this precious moment of community and solidarity that so many of us have looked forward to, but is not possible, bringing that pride into our own homes for this special moment. I'm going to ask my panelists to reveal themselves by clicking on their video link so that we can actually see you. Welcome. It's great to have you all with us. So today we are joined by three amazing panelists, and I'm going to introduce them just in a moment. But just so that you are in the right Zoom room, this is going to be a discussion about the joys, the incredible pride, but also the risks and the challenges and the frustrations of organizing pride in difficult or hostile environments. Many of us on this call will regularly attend prides that seem to be the most normal and easy thing in the world, to turn up at Pride and be part of a really joyous celebration in which you feel welcomed, safe, understood by the media, understood by politicians, and even understood by religious groups. Unfortunately, that's not the case everywhere in the world, and our three panelists today all come from countries where that isn't necessarily the case. So I'm going to introduce our panel first. First, Melusi Simelane. He's the founder of Eswatini Sexual and Gender Minorities, and he uses his voice to bring awareness to the conditions under which LGBT+ people and other minority groups actually live in Swaziland. He was the lead organizer of the first ever Pride in Swaziland, something that I actually had the privilege to be present at as well. And it truly was a wonderful and joyous occasion. And I think it's really important to point out today that Melusi is right now currently in the middle of a legal battle to have his organization registered explicitly and proudly as an LGBT+ organization in Swaziland. And this is the first step for Melusi and his colleagues in terms of going down that long and bumpy road towards full decriminalization of homosexuality in Eswatini. So welcome, Melusi. Next up, I want to introduce Rowan Mohammed, who is a Caribbean feminist and social justice activist. And Rowan is based in Barbados. Her advocacy has focused primarily on promoting women's leadership in Caribbean LGBT+ discourse, on collaboration, on facilitating safe spaces, on access to resources, and on platforms for empowerment of LGBT+ communities. She also works on combating religious intolerance, on public education and visibility. So it sounds like you keep very busy. She's director of Pride Barbados and coordinator of Barbados's annual Pride Parade. So another wonderful Pride organizer with us. You're so welcome, Rowan. And then last but not least, Isaac Mckeisha is Advocacy and Communications Director at Spectrum in Uganda. He is also the coordinator of Pride Festivals in Uganda since 2016 and a former board member of Pan-African International Lesbian and Gay Association. Isaac, I know also from personal experience, has stood fearlessly and tirelessly with his community in defiance of a government that has often used violence and intimidation to try and stop Pride. So we're going to hear these three voices in a moment. But before we do so, we have a very short musical treat. One of All Out's partners in Uganda, where Isaac is from, is a wonderful music collective called Rainbow Riots. They're a politically and religiously independent non-profit organization who also advocate for LGBTQ rights through music. Rainbow Riots very generously offered to provide some kind of musical introduction to this panel. Unfortunately, because of the very strict lockdown in Uganda, which Isaac, I'm sure, will tell us more about in a moment, they weren't able to get access to their musical instruments. So they're going to just give us a brief introduction. They're going to play one of their tracks in the background and just give us a little dance to one of their signature tracks, Freedom. So I'm going to ask my colleague Matthias to play that for us now. And it looks like we don't have sound, right? Is anyone else getting sound? No. Okay, just bear with us. We're working on it.
There's no sound.
We're working on it. If we can't get the sound to come up, we'll move on and play it later. Okay, we'll move on. We'll see if we can get Rainbow Rights to join us later on to give us their introduction. So I'm going to move now to the panel discussion to have a chat with Melusi, Isaac, and Rowan. Before I do that, just to let everybody know who's in the audience that you can use the Q&A panel, which is at the bottom of your screen, to ask questions to our panelists. We'll cover some of those questions as we're going through, and we'll cover some of them at the end. If you're on Facebook, you can also ask questions. You just need to type into the Facebook comments panel. My wonderful colleague Yuri, who is monitoring Facebook, will pass those questions through to me so that we can include you in the conversation as well. So there's one piece of important background information, I think, before we discuss Pride itself. The title of this panel was Organizing Pride Where It Is Illegal to Be Gay. And we do use that as very useful shorthand, but it doesn't precisely describe the exact situation in the three countries represented by the panelists today. So, like, kicking off with Rowan, can you explain to us what exactly is and isn't criminalized in your country?
Hi, thank you for having me, and thank you everybody for joining in. So yeah, I do think that this distinction is really important because in Barbados and across the Anglophone or English-speaking Caribbean, in the 1800s, when we were under British colonial law, the British monarchy and the British church under Christianity criminalized same-sex intimacy through what is commonly known as the buggery laws, also the serious indecency acts. So through that, the acts of same-sex intimacy are criminalized. They aren't necessarily enforced very widely, but they are enforced sometimes, and they're often enforced in instances of statutory rape. But because these laws exist, they are generally known as the laws which criminalize homosexuality, quote unquote. But it is important to make this distinction so that we're aware of the fact that it's not illegal to be gay, and that our organizing and our gathering is not illegal, and that we have an inalienable human right to do so as LGBT people. But yeah, the acts of same-sex intimacy in Barbados and across the Eastern Caribbean, or Anglophone Caribbean rather, are criminalized.
Thanks so much, Sharon. And Isaac, is that similar, different, identical? What's the situation in Uganda?
Thank you so much, Matt. I think we actually so much share the same situation in Uganda, that same-sex acts are criminalized, but being LGBT, being gay is okay. You could be gay, but the act is what is criminalized, and it's termed as a natural offense. So that is basically the distinction, and I think it cuts across from most of the countries that are colonized by the Great Britain. And it's almost the same situation with the Barbados and I think most of Africa. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks guys for kind of making that distinction. I think it's a really important starting point. So I want to move to Pride. That's what we're here to talk about today. It's Pride Week. The world is having a very unusual Pride year with probably literally thousands of Zoom conversations going on around the world, and with a major global Pride event taking place at the weekend that I know Rowan is going to be present at. So Melusi, if I can first come to you and talk about your personal journey. How did you first get involved in organizing Pride in your country? What was your motivation? What was your emotional journey to take that big step to suggest that Swaziland needed Pride?
Well, first of all, thank you so much, Matt, for giving me the opportunity to be a part of this conversation. I think for us, we have for so long been dreaming about having something as big as Pride. I mean, obviously, we all recognize, the Stonewall Inn riots of 1969, but with the new ambassador from the United States that we have at the moment, Ambassador Lisa Patterson, when she came into the country to start her term, she started this culture of, inviting her to her private home just to have a nice lunch in celebration and in commemoration of the Stonewall Inn riots, as we today call it Pride. And this happened for 2 consecutive years. And at that point, we started thinking, pondering that this is not actually a good look for us. I mean, first and foremost, the whole idea of LGBT rights being a westernized thing, it was not a good look for us. So we started having conversations with her to say, look, I think it's about time that we host Pride and actually invite you. And she loved that idea. And she said she doesn't even understand why it has taken us so long. So that is when then the idea started coming into motion. And then we had people who knew people who eventually introduced us to you, Matt. And we eventually got to meet in London. I think it was March, or was it subsequently in May of 2018. And then we started, having the broader conversation about bringing Pride to Eswatini. It was not easy, but that seed that was planted by seeing Ambassador Patterson push us towards the right direction, it actually inspired us to start taking things into our own hands. And that is how then we began to host Pride.
Wonderful, and hopefully that 2018 starting point will be the first of many decades of successful Prides there. Isaac, Ugandan Pride has a somewhat longer history. Tell us about the history of Pride in Uganda and about your own personal journey when you became part of and then led that Pride committee and have been such an instrumental part in delivering Pride in Uganda.
Thank you so much, Matt. Pride Uganda has a journey since about 2012. That was the first Pride. There's so many attempts since then, but I think the very first one that had really a clear journey and the start where people had dreams and memories was 2012. But of course, in 2012, we had a hiccup. That's the first time when people were arrested and harassed and the rest of the things. I personally joined in 2015 as a volunteer on the committee. And basically, I was looking at how is it not possible for someone to actually celebrate their life? Why is it so hard to talk about who we are, who we want to be, who we love, who we care about, and who exactly makes sense to us, And so definitely I personally, from my own motivation and passion and love for a lot of things, I thought, this is how it's supposed to be. So I joined then as a volunteer, but I thought I needed to play much more role than just that, And that's when in 2016, I became part of the committee that was actually organizing. And since then, it's been a challenging time. It's been amazing at the same time for me, because I think I have addressed my fears. I've looked at how unfair the world is at the same time. And I've not wanted to really ever think that it's actually not fine not to be the same as other people. So I think for me, the journey has been really amazing, that I have seen myself change hearts, change attitudes of people. And at the same time, seen my community cry, seen my community yearn for something that they can't actually have, that is peaceful or well organized. And so for me, it's really, we need like something to call a growing journey, a journey to look at and think about myself and think about, it's time for change, and time is now.
Thanks so much, Isaac. Thank you so much. It's just an incredible journey that both you personally have been on, and the movement in Uganda from 2012. Rowan, tell us about...
Time is me. It has been interesting throughout all these years. I've tried to
yeah, exactly.
Yeah, I've tried to do my best part and then try to make sure I actually make it work. And I think I'm impressed a bit with also the community and the morale that comes from the community, that the community is actually very interested in seeing how do we unite, how do we come together, how do we do this, how do we make it happen. And I'm actually grateful for all out for the support for the past almost 4 years, that you've been at the forefront of looking at how do Ugandan LGBT community members actually come together and be happy, no matter the police arrests year after year, police raiding or events. It's quite amazing for me, I would say. The journey is amazing. And of course, when I attended last year, 50 years of Stonewall, and I was told, the journey of Stonewall was actually 50 years. I was like, you know what? Maybe we are making actually very good steps as Uganda, because guess what? We don't have 50 years. But we are here giving people sleepless nights, giving police sleepless nights, giving ministers sleepless nights. They want to know what are we up to as pride organizers. So for me, honestly, the journey is great. Yeah.
Thanks so much. Rowan, tell us the story of both of Barbados Pride and your personal journey within that community of pride organizers.
Yeah, so I've been involved in advocacy and organizing for LGBT and feminist issues and general human rights issues as well in Barbados since I was at university here when I was in my late teens. And Pride as a global movement and as a global event, when we see it from the global south or from a lot of different developing countries, I think what comes to mind quite often is a particular image. We see or we think of first and foremost people who are white, thin from the global north, cisgender, often able-bodied people, and we have particular imagery of what pride looks like, sort of celebration in the streets with these people who don't really look like us. And I think that feeds into the narrative of pride or LGBT issues being a Western import. But through my organizing in the Caribbean, I came to realize that pride always existed in different facets in our region, whether it be pre-colonization and the indigenous people who occupy this land, many of the people who were stolen from Western Africa through slavery and were enslaved in Barbados and the Caribbean came from spaces which celebrated gender and sexual diversity. And even in our local context, throughout the 60s and the 70s, there were many displays of LGBT pride. We have a local activist, Alexa Hoffman, who's a trans woman who organized a human rights walk, I believe in 2015. So there have been different displays of LGBT pride, but in 2018, a lot of different representatives of civil society who are working on many different LGBT issues across the board in Barbados decided to come together so that we could formally commemorate Pride Month, because one, we do think that we should be able to celebrate Pride within our context, but we do think that we should have autonomy over what that looks like. So it's important that as Caribbean people, we're able to come together and define that narrative and tell that story for ourselves, so that we could sort of reclaim the narrative that surrounds LGBT issues in Barbados, but that when we talk about Pride, we're the ones who are leading and shaping that narrative. So it's important for us that this has been a collaborative initiative, So we have representatives of organizations who are working with LGBT families. Myself, I work particularly with queer women and trans people. We have people from organizations who are working on providing services, particularly around sexual and reproductive health and mental health and wellness to the community. We have people who are doing trans organization, or organizing for trans rights within our communities. So we think it's really, really important that Pride in Barbados is intersectional. It is a collaborative initiative, and that we're catering to the multi-diversity and the multi-dimensional nature of our communities. You know, we have people who are from all different walks of life, all different races, ages, abilities, classes, HIV status, so many different things. So we want to make sure that Pride has encompassed and created a space for all of these different people who are parts of our community. So for me, it's been really important in my journey as an activist that I'm participating in something that is intersectional, and also represents our community and our diversity in a really fair way. And I mean, there's always work that can be done, and we're constantly working on trying to be more inclusive and to be more diverse.
Wonderful. I love that narrative that you've articulated there about kind of reclaiming that story, that this global thing that we call Pride can have so many different manifestations in so many places around the world, and it sounds like, you know, you've done a lot of work to invest in that need for intersectionality. So I want to stick with you for a moment, Roanne, because you've articulated like a really ambitious like vision and delivery of Pride. So within that, sort of to give us a behind the scenes kind of view, what are some of the challenges that you and your co-organizers have faced in delivering Pride in Barbados?
Oh man, there's so many. I mean, from a logistical standpoint, it's always difficult to resource LGBT organizing in the Caribbean. And I think in many global South countries, I think a lot of people don't necessarily see the value in coordinating something like Pride. So resources and finding and securing the resources for this thing that we think is really important for our community is always a challenge, but we're able to maneuver, use in-kind resources where possible, put all of our heads together. And I think it's really great that we're a collaborative initiative because we're able to resource our movements a lot easier that way. But I do think that one of the major hurdles and challenges that we face in Barbados has been religious hostility and opposition. And that is particularly from the evangelical churches in Barbados, because we are a nation which is quote unquote post-colonial, but we're still dealing with a lot of remnants of colonization. And one of those is the presence of evangelical religion, which is very anti-LGBT in its rhetoric. So when we launched in 2018, and we announced our plan to have a parade at the end of the month, because it was a month long full of different events. But the parade was obviously one of the most visible and high profile and public events. When we did launch and make that announcement that we're having a parade, this very organized right-wing group in Barbados who is really dedicated to anti-LGBT organizing, they came out with a call for the state to cancel Pride. And they were really going on the narrative that it's illegal to be gay, and so that it's illegal for us to gather and it's illegal for us to organize. So that, again, that's why I think it's important to make that distinction that LGBT people are endowed with certain human rights. And one of those rights is the right to assemble and the right to protest, even though this wasn't necessarily a protest. It was a protest and a celebration of who we were. But the church did have a very visible and public call to denounce this and to cancel any events of gathering for Pride. And while they didn't necessarily promote violence in their speech directly, following that, I think a lot of people felt emboldened and empowered, and they felt like they had permission to use the anti-LGBT rhetoric that was coming out of the evangelical messaging and use that to make credible threats of violence. So coming up to the parade, we had hundreds of threats. We had death threats. People were threatening to, you know, bomb us, threatening to like shoot into the crowd. It was just a huge looming threat of violence. So that's something that we were really, really afraid of. But luckily we had the police present with us. And our first parade ended up being incident free. It was free of violence and free of any sort of major opposition on the actual day. But those threats, they're credible and they're scary. And a lot of community members were really, really afraid to be visible, in addition to being visible in a country where there is no legal protection against discrimination on the basis of sexual orientation or gender identity or sexual characteristics. Then there was the additional threat of violence. So a lot of people didn't want to be visible on that day. But there was a lot of ally participation, and we also saw the same in 2019 as well.
Fantastic, thank you. You know, again, it's a recurring theme, but I just want to pay testament to the courage of taking that space, taking your place in society against some of those threats that you've talked about. Melusi, I'd like to put the same question to you in terms of the challenges of you know, that first year in 2018, where I actually could see you and could see the enormous energy it required, seemingly with you working 24/7 to pull that thing off. Tell us about the challenges of organizing Pride in Eswatini.
I think Matthew rightly said that we were working actually 24/7 a day. And it was really incredible the amount of support that we got. And I mean, I love focusing on the positive side of things. The amount of support that we were getting from individuals on the streets, less so from other civil society organizations. I mean, you might remember that we had one big civil society organization that came out in the newspaper to say that they do not support these because they believe we are unnatural and against the order of God, which then goes back to what Rowan is saying, you know, the whole history of the colonial rule, it left us with remnants of that sort of religious understanding of what life should be as we know it. So we had a lot of backlash from the church. And funny enough, at the time, the police spokesperson is a pastor. So he was a spokesperson for the police at the time. He started using his platform as a pastor to now start bashing us as LGBT people. And that was being perceived as the police actually bashing us. So those are some of the challenges that we were facing while we were organizing. It got so much to the point where just 3 days before we actually were to hold Pride, we had to be called in by the police to say they don't understand what is happening and they are thinking of shutting us down. And there was a lot of negotiation that was going on there. And of course, we had the support of the international community. But I think mostly it is the religious fanaticism, which is mostly from the evangelicals. And I mean, funny enough, the Catholic Church in the country is one of the very few churches that has sort of grown to accept diversity, and they are somehow quietly supporting the movement. But you still have those fanatics in the evangelical movement that still believe that LGBT rights are not human rights, and they still believe that we should be shut down. So it was a really, really troublesome time, and we were spending sleepless nights, but it made things easier for us because subsequently we've been able to hold a second Pride last year, and we are going to be holding another one in September. So it has made things easier because now the conversation becomes easier to be had because you have to fight the first battle so that, you know, the other battles become easier.
Yeah, thanks so much. Isaac, I'm going to move to you now. And as far as you feel comfortable answering this question, because I'm going to move it onto a more personal level, not just about organizing the Pride logistics and the politics of that, but in terms of you as a person, could you talk a little bit about the risks that you feel that you have exposed yourselves to over the course of the last few years as a Pride organizer?
Well, to be honest, it's quite been a very tough journey on my personal side. I would say coming from a very Christian family, and at the end of the day, I appear in public newspapers, and then my family has to ask me what was I doing at this event, and I have to disclose that, you know, I actually organized an event for LGBT persons in Uganda. For me, I think, like I said earlier, it's been like a journey to grow and accept who I am, and you know, talk about myself and openly express my feelings and talk about what I actually love, or what I'm passionate about, and which is, you know, human rights for all. But of course, far from that, part of the challenge has been, you know, when you wake up and find yourself in a public newspaper, and maybe you get about 20 people texting you and asking you, what the fuck is this? How did you do this? Why did you have to do this? You know, why do you have to expose your life? Why do you have to put yourself in papers? And definitely at the end of the day, maybe these are people who care about you and who think maybe it wasn't the right thing. And guess what? You now have to explain to 20 people, maybe giving 20 different explanations of why, because maybe there's one whose family, and maybe for family, I have to give them to them and good to them. And then now if it's a friend, maybe I don't care, I don't give much of, you know, so I also have to tell them something different. And at the end of the day, you get all this social media bashing and you know, schoolmates and people like that telling you all these things. But guess what? The most interesting thing is some of them, and one of them, 2 of them, 10 of them, are willing to understand why you actually did it, why you actually part of that. And I think for me, my journey is more amazing because I've been able to change lives. I've been able to change people's perspective about, you know, LGBT people, LGBT socializing, LGBT people coming together. And that's what I aim at. I aim at looking at who is the enemy and who is likely to be the supporter tomorrow, you know. So those are the people I've wasted my time on and put my time on, and actually understood that maybe the society in Uganda does not understand LGBT people. Maybe it is up to us to work so hard to make actually demystify the myth around LGBT persons. And I think over the years, even when I'm doing all these pride events, I make sure that pride events are more allies than actually community members. I make sure we have friends to the LGBT community rather than the LGBT community itself. Because you know what? Because I think the people who are actually against our lives are those people who So how about to make a lot of work around that? How about now from within 200 people who are going to talk to other people, other 200 people to understand what the community is about. And this has worked over years. If you look at Pride in 2016, I could say we had maybe 200 people. 2017, we had more than that. The numbers have doubled and doubled. And every other year, we are getting this local people asking us, when is the next Pride event? So it means that because of my work, because of my committee, we have been able to change attitudes of people, and we are able to change the communities that we actually live in. And for me, that's what gives me pride. I honestly don't think there's a history. When I traveled to Germany last year, and I realized that their journey has actually been 156 years. So guess what? Uganda, we have not even moved maybe 30 years. We're talking about LGBT rights. But guess what? We are talking about things to do with pride. Get things to do with, get on the streets and tell every person who's on the street that, yo, we exist, this is us every day, and we're not going.
And you know what, Isaac, having seen all 3 of you in action, I don't think it's going to take...
The children, we are your sons, maybe we are your daughters, we are...
Sorry, Isaac, you were breaking up a bit there. I was just interrupting you to say that having seen you three of you in action, I don't think it's going to take 150 years in any of your countries. And I think what you've just said, it just goes to the very heart of what Pride is all about. It's about demystifying, it's about shifting the conversation, changing hearts and minds, and bringing allies into a really sort of beautiful rainbow moment. I want to ask the same question to Roanne about your own kind of personal risks. As far as you feel comfortable, just tell us a little bit about how that has impacted on your life over the last few years.
Oh man, I mean, aside from coordinating Pride, being visible in a space where there is a higher level of hostility towards gender and sexual minorities is always difficult. And in Barbados, we don't have as high levels of physical violence or physical threat as a lot of other places, but there is still an atmosphere of permission to discriminate against LGBT people. And I mean, physical violence is still a reality, particularly I think for people who are living in many different intersections of oppression. So for people who are poor, people who are living in urban areas, people who don't have economic security, people who are visibly gender non-conforming, they live with a higher level of risk just navigating their everyday lives. So of course I do have some level of privilege. Many people assume that I'm heterosexual when they see me. You know, I don't have to mitigate a lot of the risks that somebody who is poor and trans might have to deal with when they're walking through the city or when they're doing sex work. But there has been a level of risk in being visible, and particularly being a visible queer woman. So there is always the overarching threat of punishing rape and sexual violence to sort of correct my sexual orientation. And that comes from men all of the time. And being a visible woman, I mean, sexual violence is pervasive in the Caribbean in general, but for women who are living at the intersection of being women and also being a sexual minority, people feel that it's okay to sort of threaten you with sexual violence to correct your sexual orientation. A newspaper here in 2016 published an incident where a gender non-conforming woman was sexually assaulted, and they published all of the details of her assault in the gossip column. And they said that she received quote unquote male medicine. So that just speaks to the level of pervasiveness of and the normalization of sexual violence against queer women. Personally, that risk is always around, but I mean, I have had my home broken into and somebody wrote me a note saying that I should burn in hell for being a lesbian. While I slept in my bedroom, somebody broke in and left that note in my living room and ransacked my apartment. So it is multifaceted, you know. I do have a certain level of protection that a lot of privileges allow me, but there's always a risk when you are visibly queer and participating in movement building, particularly in a space where people are so adamantly against your movement.
Yeah, thank you so much. I want to move the conversation on now and ask you, Melusi, about your sense of what Pride has meant for the LGBT plus community. Swaziland, Eswatini, it's a very small country in Southern Africa. It's a small-ish community. And I'd love you to just sort of share with our audience what Pride organizing and the experience of being at Pride has meant for that community.
I think, Matt, more than anything, it's about that whole idea of coming together just for one day and realizing that you are not alone, and realizing that there are many people who support who you are, but more so who are like you. And I think that is very important for people to recognize that Pride is about giving the space for people to recognize that it's normal to be who they are. And I just want to go back to what Rowan was saying about, you know, the intersectionality of our struggles. And I think what Pride has meant for us as a Swatini is actually going back to the drawing board and thinking about what exactly was the motivation, you know, at the Stonewall Inn riots in 1969. It was not just about saying, hey, look, we're here, we exist, but it was more about saying, at the end of the day, we are human just like you. And what we have done right now is move actually Pride Month from June for Eswatini and moved it to September. And now bearing in mind that we're still living under, you know, the common law offense of sodomy, which is a colonial hangover because it was part of the British colonial law, the laws. And so the independence in Eswatini is in September. So what we have done is to say September now must be the month where we all celebrate who we are. September must be the month where we all reclaim who we are. It must be the month where we are all reassured of our identities, we're all reassured and reaffirmed of our sexuality. So Pride has been quite a beautiful thing. And there's a lot of things that are happening even now in June, because we cannot, you know, throw away this idea of Stonewall happening in June. So we are still recognizing that June is International Pride Month, but further, we are making it home. We are making it homegrown, and we are reclaiming and localizing it by celebrating it in September. So it's been quite a long journey from 2018, and also from learning from what has been happening around the world. But what we have done in Eswatini is try to redefine what it means for us in terms of claiming our identities.
Great, wonderful. We have some questions coming in, and I just want to invite our audience to continue to send those questions. We're going to come to them in just a moment. I want to ask each of you relatively briefly, because we are a little bit pushed on time, but if you had to describe your biggest single moment of joy around Pride in your country, whether that's the organizing, the advocacy around it, the participation on the day? What would be your single moment of pure joy? And let's start with you, Rowan.
I do think that there's so many. I think just seeing initiatives come to fruition is really exciting and really fulfilling. But there was one particular moment in 2018 when we had our first Pride Parade. And because it was so surrounded by controversy, we went into that day really, really afraid, or at least I was afraid of violence. I was afraid of somebody being harmed. I was afraid of being shot. I was just afraid of so many different things, but I carried that fear with me, and I affirmed that it wouldn't let me stop our mission for that day. And I was honestly expecting that there would maybe be like 10 people on the street on that day because of the fear and because it is such a polarizing topic. But when I got there, there were like 200 people, most of which were allies. But there was one particular moment where Dee Winston, who is a pioneer for LGBT activism in Barbados, she's a trans woman who co-founded the first LGBT organization in Barbados, UGLAB. There was a moment where we were parading through the capital, and we passed in front of Parliament, and the news, the Nation News stopped us, which is a large media house here. They stopped and they were interviewing Dee, and she was just talking about how fulfilling it was to see that the movement has come this far, and she never thought that this is something that she would have been able to witness in her lifetime. And she was just so happy about it, and she said that she was really happy to just be living her life as a trans woman and being visible in Barbados and being able to enjoy the fruits of her labor. And that really moved me to tears, and I started crying in the streets because it was just really, really fulfilling to be able to see so many Black and brown queer people and trans people and allies being able to claim space and affirm that we deserve to belong in our society. So yeah, that was, I think, one of the most joyful moments for me.
Sounds wonderful. It's very moving to hear that. Isaac, what about you? What's the single moment of joy that you remember most from your Pride organizing?
Well, thank you so much. I think it's just not just one, but I'll just try and look at maybe the most memorable ones. For me, really, in 2017, I was very, very, very pleased to see a lot of transgender people, transgender community members walking down a very long walkway on a fashion show that we organized in a very public place. And for me, this was very powerful to see that actually, far from people being humiliated from public events and rest of the things, they could have such a moment of seeing people being themselves. People putting on the right attire that they feel they belong to, people actually wearing the right makeup that they think they should put on, and walking the long walkway of as if it was the Golden Globes or the Oscars. And this was happening right in Uganda for me. And for me, this was powerful, in all my entire life organizing. And then one other thing was about, knowing that Isaac, a single individual, is organizing an event that is supposed to bring a community together. And then guess what? A whole minister, a whole president, a whole state house is not sleeping because they want to know what are they thinking about.
Yeah.
So for me, this is, at the end of the day, I want to know what the opponent is thinking about. I want to know if the effect is on them. How are they going through it? How are they taking it in? And this is the most powerful moments for me for Pride, because Pride in Uganda it's not a celebration, it's a protest. It's a protest against unfair forces that actually think are powerful. But this is humanity we're talking about. We're talking about celebrating humanity. And then these people that think they have police, they have guns, they have tear gas, they have everything, are actually not sleeping because they want to know what Isaac is organizing. What is Isaac's community thinking about? So for me, that whole bit of joy, even if it lasts for 10 minutes, it means that I'm actually doing something that is right. Something that actually one person thinks that they don't have to sleep before they disorganize it. And I think that's what Pride is. Pride for us here is a protest, not a celebration. Once we are lucky that actually it goes through well, and I think, I mean, that's always our moments. But otherwise, we plan for the worst. And if we get the best, that's it. But guess what? We don't give up. We always want to make sure it happens. We give people headache. We want them to think beyond when they go back to their beds and think, oh, wait, maybe this community is actually notorious, because most times, even when they close one event, in 10 minutes, we already have another venue for the same event. So that kind of, a community that is resilient, that does not give up, that even when the event is disrupted in 10 minutes, the next 30 minutes is the new plan, and a new plan of continuing and not giving up. That for me is powerful. And I think that's what I work for when I wake up.
So absolutely, and like it's just wonderful to hear you kind of owning that power. And again, I can speak to the tenacity of the Ugandan Pride movement in not allowing a little police disruption to ruin an evening of Pride celebrations. That then it's the next plan and the next plan and the next plan as the disruption goes on. Melusi, your moment of joy to be shared with us.
I think I'll agree with Isaac in the sense of, giving the police a run for their money and actually giving the entire state a run for their money, keeping them on toes and wondering what we're going to do next when there is actually nothing that we're going to do. We are just going to march the streets of the capital and be proud of who we are. But I think for me, Matt, you were there on that very first one. I was like a zombie. I hadn't slept in like days because we were doing a lot of work. But then later, when that documentary that was shot during the day, I was watching it. And then there is a moment where, because there were 3 people that were interviewed, it was a gay man, a lesbian woman, and a trans woman. So there was a moment where this trans lady was saying, look, we have seen Pride happening everywhere, but this time it's in Swaziland. And this time we are going to show them, no matter what. And when she said, no matter what, I was like, God, this is what we have done for people. We have given them an opportunity. And like Isaac is saying, even if it's for 10 minutes, this is an opportunity for people to come out and say, this is who we are, and we're happy about it. And no matter what everyone else thinks about it, it's our identities and we own it. And I think that for me was like one of my biggest, greatest moments. And except one other bit that happened when we were marching the streets, because you remember, Matt, there was a lot of changes because the police didn't want to give us the big streets. And when we were about to take a turn, instead of going to the big streets, people didn't want to go to the now lately agreed upon streets, and people wanted to go up. And the police were just there. They were not fighting with anyone. They were just smiling and, negotiating with them, saying, no, guys, you have to use that. And that sort of gave me the impression that, these are police that are just here on orders from the powers that might be, but some of them are in support of what we're doing. Some of them understand that this is an issue of basic human rights. So I think for me, seeing people being happy and seeing people realize that we are doing it for humanity, and we are doing it to remind ourselves that, what, it doesn't matter. They might hate us. We might go through the worst of prejudice. We might go through the worst of stigma and discrimination. At the end of the day, history would absolve us because this is who we are.
Awesome, fantastic. I'm going to move to a few questions from our audience. I'm going to start with Lutz, who is joining us from Cape Town in South Africa. And he has a question that's very specifically about the vulnerability of LGBT plus teenagers and how can Pride actually reach out to youngsters. So who would like to take that? Can I have a volunteer?
I can speak about our context in Barbados. So as I mentioned, Pride in Barbados is a collaborative and community initiative with a lot of different civil society organizers who are working on different areas of advocacy and activism and LGBT organizing throughout the country. So one of the organizations that is part of our community initiative to organize Pride is Equals Barbados. And this is an organization which really, really focuses on providing safe space for youth, LGBT youth in particular, and offering them access to crucial services that they might not be able to access through the public healthcare system. So that focuses on sexual and reproductive health, also mental health. So we've made sure that Equals has been able to integrate some of that into our Pride celebrations and our commemoration of Pride, because I think people do focus a lot on the parade, but Pride isn't just about the parade, you know, it's about assessing what our community needs and figuring out how we as organizers are able to meet those needs. So I do think that we need to address the vulnerability of youth, particularly trans youth and gender non-conforming youth. So integrating those elements into our Pride celebrations and into the events that we have throughout the month has been really important. And they've been able to, youth who aren't able to visibly participate in Pride activities because of whatever reasons, are able to participate in these spaces. And this year that we are having a physically distanced Pride, a lot of our events have been virtual. So we've had a couple panel discussions which focus on religion and reconciling faith and religion, because that's a huge issue for a lot of youth here. So it's just about having conversations, and I think increasing the visibility of LGBT issues as well, and engaging with parents and guardians of LGBT youth in particular.
Great, thank you so much. And I think 2020 has been a really tough year for Prides, and that moment of community that we feel when we're physically together has been lost. But I think on the other hand, the silver lining on that very dark cloud is that all the virtual events in the world has given access actually to a lot of people, including young people, who may not have had the confidence to turn up physically. I want to move to another question for, I'm going to put this one to Melusi actually, because I think the question may have been inspired by the background behind you and the logo of your organization, Eswatini Gender and Sexual Minorities, Melusi. So it's from Leslie. And first of all, she says all of you are an inspiration, but she'd like to ask what you think of changing the Rainbow Pride flag to include black and brown and trans flag colors. Leslie says, it seems to me that this would partly recognize the sadly often overlooked important contribution of people of color to the LGBTQ+ community, and also the leading role played by black trans women in the Stonewall riots. So Melusi, perhaps talk to us a little bit about why you chose that logo, and more generally about the debate around flags.
So first and foremost, I'm someone who has worked in the LGBT space for so long, locally, obviously, and now only starting this new organization that I want to focus explicitly on LGBTIQ issues has actually made it easier for me to do all these things that I saw in the past as gaps. First and foremost, we all agree and appreciate, you know, the traditional rainbow colors of the flag. But what we have seen with the movement is the neglect of, you know, the Black lives inside the LGBT movement. I mean, a beautiful example, if you go to South Africa, we have today what is called Johannesburg Pride, which a lot of people might argue that has become a lot of, you know, whitewashed in a sense. And then you've got a Soweto Pride. And if you understand the history of apartheid, you'll understand that Joburg, the city, this is where the white people lived. And then Soweto, this is where the black people were moved. So now you've had people to come out and say, they're going to have Johannesburg Pride and we are going to have a Soweto Pride. So it is that background and, you know, everything that has been happening in the past, you know, with London Pride Met, you know, the whole thing of now having a black London Pride. It's the understanding that it's not even an issue of fighting about our races, it's an issue of intersectionality and understanding that the Black lives have been disenfranchised in the past. Even within the movement, some of our white queer people still have those privileges, which they are not comfortable to share with us as queer people. And it's worse even if you look into now the Black community. If you're just a Black person, and you are queer, that becomes now a compounded hindrance. So we wanted to deliberately identify that, you know what, we are a queer community, but we are also a Black and queer community. Even in a country like Eswatini, where many people will argue, well, there's not a lot of white people in Eswatini, but that's not the point. The point is about privilege and the position of power that some people hold within the movement. And it's not a fight, it's not about taking precedence over one thing or the other. It's just about the recognition that LGBT people are diverse, and you know, we have to respect the diversity within the LGBT community itself. I hope I've answered that question.
Yeah, I'm sure Leslie will think that you have. I thought that was a great answer. Isaac, I'm going to put the next audience question to you, and it comes from Matt. And Matt says, how successful have narratives explaining homophobia as a colonial import been in challenging homophobia in your community?
Thank you so much. Definitely, the thing is, one of the challenge that we've had is the religious community, which unfortunately shares the biggest portion of Ugandans. You know, while as activists, while as human rights defenders, we have maybe 3 to 4 days or 1 hour in a day to talk about how we can change perspectives. But the religion still shares about a full day on Sunday, talking about, you know, how this is illegal, how this is bad, how this is not preached about. So definitely, we still have that challenge ahead of us as activists. But I think the narrative of, you know, talking about who we are and those things can only matter to the people that live next to us, people that affect us every day. And this is our families, our friends, our workmates, our you know, our bosses at work and the rest of the things. And I think this is why majorly as a person, I believe in what we call coming out, you know, coming out the people next to you. Because if you come out the people next to you, maybe they're 10. And guess what? If these 10 people understand you, it is the only narrative that you need to give the community. These 10 people will affect the next 20 people. Because guess what? Everyone has 2 people that they may be support or are responsible about. And this is how it has to change. Otherwise, if we live in an isolated world and a position whereby we think we need to be together and only us as community members, then it won't work. And that's why for my Pride organizing events, have tried as much as possible to bring allies and people who are not actually part of the community. Because the community, we already know ourselves, you know. We already know who we need to bring for them to believe in us. And it has seemed to work, because year after year, we have a different crowd of people. We have a different crowd of people inviting us to actually talk to them about, you know, LGBT rights in Uganda, how far we've gone, how much work we're doing. So definitely, it's not a journey that will change in one day, but it's a journey that we have seen taking baby steps. And at some point, we've gone added steps, and then sometimes we have to pull ourselves back and say, maybe you're going so fast and we need to, you know, relax a bit. But it's promising, I would say. It's really promising.
Thanks so much, Isaac. I'm gonna finish with a question from Catherine in the UK, and I think this is a good place to finish, because one thing that I know from working with all of you is that prides anywhere, let alone in difficult or hostile environments, don't happen without support, without solidarity, without resources. So Catherine asks, as a white British Christian, recognizing the awful impact of my country and the church, what can I do to support your prides now? Rowan.
Thanks for that question, Catherine. I do think that giving resources is fundamental. A lot of people, you know, send thoughts and prayers and good wishes and stuff, but organizations and movements, particularly from the global south, who have been so heavily impacted by the remnants of colonization and the effects of colonization and white supremacy, need resources that are reparations. So I do think when you are able, those resources should be given directly and freely, without question, to organizers from the global south. I do think also, whenever you can, it is important to center the voices and the realities of these people from our communities, particularly the most marginalized. Whenever you can pass the mic, do so. Whenever you see an opportunity to highlight the voices of people from these communities, do so. And, you know, I think there's a lot of often white guilt and, you know, colonizer guilt that takes place, and it's not really helpful. People need resources, and people need access to platforms to visibilize their communities. And one last thing that I think is crucial, that people from the global north often do, even though it's well-intentioned, is sort of portraying the global south or developing countries or LGBT movements in developing countries as, you know, some of the most homophobic or some of the most transphobic places on earth. And that is a really, really dangerous rhetoric, because it ignores the reality that colonization brought homophobia and transphobia to us. Those were the imports. We aren't inherently backward or uncivilized or inherently homophobic or transphobic. I think it's really important that people from these spaces bring that reality to the forefront and highlight that reality, you know, that homophobia and transphobia were imported to our communities. And this is something that we are still grappling with and still trying to dismantle. So yeah, giving resources, amplifying the voices of our communities, and fighting that narrative that we come from the most homophobic and transphobic and problematic places on earth. I think those are three really, really key and important things that you can do to support.
Thank you for being so concrete. And I hope, you know, everybody who's on this call will take that to heart and spread that news further. Isaac, how about you? How would you respond to Catherine's question about what she can do to support Pride?
I will definitely agree with Ron on the first point that Pride organizing in Africa and in Uganda specifically is very expensive. You really need to invest in a lot of resources to actually get people together, to have people say the same thing. And this is one of the challenges that we've had. And this is why I really have to thank All Out members and everyone who has been at the forefront of supporting us for the last 5 years. I think the last 4 years since All Out stepped forward, we have had community members being brought to events, being brought to all these things, because it's what it is that, you know, unfortunately, our community back here is a community that's not well empowered financially. And this is why we always ask people, please chip in, give in what you can to make sure that someone somewhere out there in Africa can actually meet other people, gather and make a cause and make it sound. And definitely for me, the only powerful thing that has happened with an empowered community like a Ugandan community is having resources financially to actually bring the community together. And thanks to All Out members.
No, thank you, Isaac. I can speak on behalf of the All Out community that it's been also for all of us, for the thousands of people who've donated. It's also been a journey, and we've been following your story. Melusi.
Look, I think I will echo both Rowan and Isaac in terms of the resources. The work that we do requires a lot of resources, human resources, financial resources, and a lot of the human resources is still aligned to the financial resources. And, you know, it's hard for organizations like ours that are still illegal, that cannot have that legal registration, you know, to acquire funds from a lot of our funders. So I think the resources issue is very big. But what I'd like to talk on is as a British citizen, I think you need to recognize that it is your government's fault, well, perhaps not fault, but it is your government's colonial past that we're in this position. And the United Kingdom has a very, very special role that it needs to play within the Commonwealth. I mean, just today on our local newspaper, we were reading that His Majesty the King has said that the Commonwealth must come together in this whole COVID-19 pandemic. And I think the Commonwealth needs to start talking about these issues, and the United Kingdom must not be afraid to own up to their mistakes of the past. And it calls upon the citizens of the United Kingdom to push their government to start owning up. I mean, in 2018, Matt, you were part of the people that were pushing for that apology from former Prime Minister Theresa May. And that was only just the beginning. It need not only be an apology, we need to see real action being put to ground to start correcting the mistakes of the past. Because the truth is, and Rowanna's already said it, and Isaac said it at the beginning, and the truth is, homophobia is not African. Homophobia came with colonization in the form of religion. And this religion came with the missionaries that came with the British colonizers. So I think they need to start owning up to their mistakes so that we can start having this conversation afresh. I hope I'm not offending anyone, but
not at all. Thank you so much for that. Really, unfortunately, we've come to the end of our available time. I am very sorry to those members of the audience who had posted questions that we won't have time to get to. I just want to just give an enormous thanks to our three panelists, to Rowan, Mohammed, Melusi Simelane, and Isaac Mugisha. I can't really describe what I think of you without sounding trite, but you are truly, all three of you, an inspiration, and just all power to you to continue the incredible work that you've already done. Thank you so much for joining us, and thank you to our audiences on both Zoom and Facebook. Goodbye.
Thank you. And thanks for all your questions, everyone.
Thank you and goodbye, everyone.